Thank you. Thank you for all bravely coming to a talk that I thought might just not have anyone present. But I think you will find it really quite useful. It's the final talk in this series, Wild Times, which is about how rapidly things are changing and how unsettling and turbulent it can be. And I've tried to take what I called a scientific and spiritual perspective, trying to understand what's going on as, in fact, quite natural and not so unusual, and in fact, having many very positive and importantly beneficial developments, which might seem a little contrary in some ways. But if you followed and come along, especially in the lecture that I gave on the evolution of civil society, we really, for the most part, don't know and are not aware of how violent our human species has been over most of its history for the last 10,000 years, and probably likely before that as well. So I'm going to start by just trying to pull together where we have been and where we're coming from, and how do I, let's see, there we go. Okay. These were the series of lectures that we had, and I'm bringing this forward again because the events of the past week in the bombing in Boston so demonstrated something from every one of these lectures. And the first one was about birth and the way things are changing about birth. This wasn't so demonstrable in the Boston bombing. But relationships, the evolution of intimacy and family, and the rise of women to achieve their own power and destiny rather than being subject under the patriarchal organization, which is what most of human history has been. It has been patriarchal. Not only do men subjugate women, men are in competition with each other, and it's the basis for the evolution of warfare, and how we got out of that warlike behavior in the last 300 years is an important story in itself. If you think about it, Europe has been at peace for the last 70 years. Unprecedented. Europe was a place of continuous warfare all the way up into the 20th century. Something happened. If you were at the lecture, you will know what it was. The other thing is that there's this whole thing now about information and the rapid spread of information all through the society, and also the growth of science in the past 300 years as the principal authority on the nature of our existence. What's going on here? How does the world work? What is the origin of life? These have now been answered and are embraced and engaged from a very important scientific perspective that has revealed enormous things through archaeology and evolutionary biology and the rise of understanding the genetic code that were just unknown in the time of those who wrote, say, sacred books like the Bible. So what I would like to point out is how these things suddenly appeared in different ways this past week. This figure you're seeing here is a bronze bust of a conqueror warrior named Tamerlane, or Timur. He lived in the 14th century, and the 14th century was a time of great violence. It's a time of the Crusades. It was a time of all of these roaming bands of young males out conquering and basically warlording and doing the kinds of things we sometimes hear about today that still take place in parts of Africa and in parts of Central Asia and parts of Afghanistan, Pakistan, these more rural, distant areas. They are still very much living in the past. Timur was an incredible conqueror, warrior. He's another figure like Genghis Khan, who had this passion to gather men around him, mount horses, feed off the grasses that grew with sheep and cattle, and then conquer cities. And they conquered and they slaughtered, and that's what they did. That's what they did for a living. Well, this is Tamarin Sarayan, who is one of the Boston Bombers. He is a boxer, and here he is boxing, and he has the name of Tamarin, or Timur. And he's from that part of his family is from the northern Caucasus, which is part of the region that was influenced by these kinds of warriors. And Timur is a great hero. Genghis Khan is a great hero to the Mongols. If you go to Mongolia, he's Jesus Christ. He is the Jesus Christ of Mongolia. And to everybody else, he's the devil. So here is young Tamarin. He loved boxing. He had a girlfriend who, it's not clear to me that he married her, but perhaps he did. She got pregnant. He insisted that she start wearing the veil, and he obviously was a very domineering personality. Kind of goes along with being that kind of male. In that episode, we see the kind of dying embers of this kind of male organization. Warlords contending with each other. One of them gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and people say, we've got to throw in my lot with Timur because we're never going to be anything without him, so I'm going to go with him. Most young men died in battle. They never got to have wives, and it was also a time of great polygamy. The big, strong men had many, many wives, and young men lost their lives mainly in battle, and there was an enormous amount of warfare. So the other thing I want to say something about is how the internet and the global society and the information that was present played a very big role in finding these men and stopping them from what they were doing. It was very important. And what I want to conclude with is that these are wont to be Timurs. They are wont to be young men who want to be big men. And David in the Bible was a young man who wanted to be a big man, and he succeeded, just like Timur did. Many of them succeed. It's not exactly something that will never work. It's rare that it will work for you, but young men threw themselves into this when they had that particular spark inside them to want to be that leader, that powerful one who would conquer, and also have many wives as part of the deal. They did not succeed. Timur is not going to succeed today. Timur is not going to have anybody gather around him. And the governance of the rest of the society in that kind of tribal situation was not anything about the consent of the governed. It was that the powerful male and the warlords who clustered around him, the gang that was the top echelon of males, imposed their will on the rest of the community. They didn't get to vote whether they wanted them or not. They had them because they were there by force. And we have somehow managed to evolve as societies, at least in most of the developed world now, where people can't just be there by force anymore. You have to get some consent of the government, of the governed, and people will say to the wannabes like Tamarin, we don't want you. We don't want you to be our leader, and we will not accept you. And It's not possible for him to gather the kind of force that he could. The bombings that they did, yes, were very destructive. But if he had been the real Timur, as happened when Timur took Delhi in India, he managed to go as far to Delhi. 100,000 people were slaughtered. Men were slaughtered. Because when you conquer the new place, you kill all the men. If this Tamrin, who we saw boxing, had been like his namesake, Boston would have 100,000 or more dead men lying in the streets. Timur, this young man, would be the leader. He would have a gang around him, and that's the kind of society we would have. That can't succeed anymore. It just can't make it. There are too many people that have enough power to have social institutions of justice and law and democracy that can hold its own against the way men gathered gangs together to be warlords, to have power and control and rule the society. Okay, so now we're going to take a breath. That's the summary of where we've been, and I now want to talk about death and dying. We're looking in this image that was taken by the Hubble telescope about as far back into the universe as we can possibly see, almost to the beginning. This is like 600 million years after the Big Bang. Now, there's a lot of stuff going on here, and I actually am happy about there's a lot of things. We're looking back through space, and there's a lot of things that are far more recent than all the things back to the 700 million years after the Big Bang. But the very faintest objects you can see are the earliest stars and galaxies. And they were born after the Big Bang, which was a pure condensation of elementary particles. They weren't even atoms, they were quarks. That's the most primitive form of matter there is. And as the Big Bang expanded, the quarks combined, and then they began to make heavy particles like protons and neutrons. Electrons would begin to combine with them. We start to have atoms, and pretty soon we get the first primal element, hydrogen. So hydrogen is the first thing that the universe is made of. And if hydrogen said, I don't want to die, I am hydrogen and I want to live, there couldn't be anything else. Hydrogen, the abundance of hydrogen had to decline. The hydrogen atoms that were present had to give way. They had to die and fuse into helium. And the helium in turn also had to combine in the nuclear chemistry of stars to make heavier elements till you finally get oxygen and carbon and nitrogen and the things that can make life. So what came before can't be eternal if you're going to have a dynamic universe, if you're going to have, finally, life. You have to have death in order to have life, in order to have something wonderful happening. Now, in these more recent stars, we have star systems that are born. So even on the small scale, after we have hydrogen and it makes helium and we start getting these other elements, the stars keep cycling. We still have stars will go through a cycle of birth and death, which is when hydrogen aggregates and the gravitational force of the hydrogen pulls it together, compresses it up to very high temperatures so that fusion reactions start and the star starts to shine. And then eventually at the end of its life, for a large number of stars, they will have what's called a supernova, where they explode and send out all of this material that includes things like carbon and iron and calcium and sulfur, these other atoms that are very hard to make in the early universe when all you have is helium around. So all of these previous elements give way and make room for new things that come into being, and these are the very elements of life. So, the universe is dynamic, it's changing. That's what this whole series, in a way, was trying to call our attention to. It's not going to stay put. We are not going to stay where we are. So the universe of all that is evolves. That is, what is present now is the starting point for what comes next. And evolution, which is the way life came into being and the way life works, is really an enormously great and divine art of the highest order. You should not think ill of evolution. You should think marvelous wonder. And evolution involves birth, wonderful birth, we like birth, and death. You can't have evolution without death. If the dinosaurs were probably immortal, there probably wouldn't be any mammals. Because life is so structured that every little niche in the ecosystem has something that wants to make a living there. And if all the ecosystem is occupied, there's no room for any new innovation. But it's dynamic, it's unstable. Nothing has a complete hold on the future. And therefore, you get new things coming into being that natural selection will bring forward because they'll be more successful at reproducing. And those that don't fit the new environment will pass away. So not only do individual organisms die, just like we die, whole species die. They go extinct. Most of the species that have ever existed are extinct, just as most of the people who ever existed are dead. But because our population explosion of the present, it's not that many, because most people have been born in the last couple hundred years. So we're in the midst of a huge population explosion. Just to finish this off, this is our sun. In about 1 billion years, it's going to throw off its outer layers as it runs out of fuel. And the outer layers are going to begin to glow with the radiation that comes from the core that's left. And these outer layers will then disperse, and the elements that were present will flow into space. And this is, in a way, now going to be the embryo. This is the beginning of new life for a new solar system that came from the death of many other solar systems. And finally, here are stars being born in the remnants of what went before. So birth is essential to life. Death is essential to life. We all know, and we all find it very easy to talk about the goodness of birth. And I would like to now, for this lecture, try to bring you forward to understand that there is a goodness in death, just from the very way the world is made and put together. And death of galaxies, death of stars and planets, death of individual organisms, death of species extinctions, birth of new galaxies, birth of new stars and planets. They go together. The two go together. Death is the beginning of new life. Death is good. And now I'm going to invite Phyllis Spiegel. I'd like to introduce her. Reverend Phyllis Spiegel is the pastor of St. Thomas's Church in Christiansburg, Virginia, and has had much experience with families, with individuals, dealing with death. And it's that personal touch that I'd like her to now bring to us.
I am a priest in the Episcopal Church, and so I come to you as I am. So what I want to do is to do a little bit of a disclaimer, and that is that whenever we speak our stories on birth and death and life in between, We cannot separate who we are. So David just lectured from a place of his experience. And I'm going to do the same. And so this is all a disclaimer to say I don't want to step on anyone's toes, and I'm also going to share some personal parts of my life because it influences my knowledge on the subject of dying and dying well. So I have had a lot of experience with death, but it goes beyond what David knows about, which is the experiences that I have at St. Thomas, and it begins when I was quite young. I grew up in a household with a dying parent. And so when I was very young, I learned that my father, as a juvenile diabetic, had a life expectancy of about 35, and I was the third child in the family. So you can imagine, he was running out of years as I was coming into increasing knowledge of my life. And I encountered, and I sort of had this understanding, but I didn't really know how much it impacted me. And I encountered in my early 20s my 5th grade teacher. And we met, we hugged, and and she said, I will never, and she was in her 80s at this point, and she said, I will never forget the day in class that we prayed for you because your father was really not doing well and he was having a surgery that day, and I couldn't teach because you were so filled with sorrow. And she said, so I just stopped, and all the kids gathered around you, and we prayed. Well, of course, you'd be fired today, right? Yes. So one of the things I'm going to talk about is the way in which we have separated ourselves from the truths of life and death. So in that moment, and I have no memory of this whatsoever, because I blocked it, because I couldn't handle all of the information that I was receiving at the time. So I did what people do, and they make blocks. So I grew up, my dad ended up dying when I was 23, but in the meantime, from the time I was in 5th grade to 23, all 4 of my grandparents died, and one of them, my grandfather, had a child 2 years younger than me. And so that meant when my aunt, when I was 12 and she lost her dad at the age of 10, see, I knew it. I knew it was something to be afraid of. I knew that it could happen. I knew that your parent could die. And so I began a very complex life of fearing death. And it didn't really help when people died because it meant long journeys in the car. It meant being around a lot of relatives that I really didn't know very well. Things that kids innately don't like anyway. You're all surrounded at these events. When I was in high school and I began my dad was really in a critical stage. We were on a bus trip and we were exhausted. I was coming back from a marching band competition and it was night and I was really tired. And what do teenage girls do when they're really tired? They cry, right? So I started thinking about my father and I started just to cry quietly. And one of my friends came back to sort of talk, and she asked what was wrong. Anyway, we had this long conversation. She was just a beautiful soul. Her name was Dee Dee Grace, and she just was a person of deep grace. And so after talking, she came back to me the next day in school, and she said, I talked to my mom and dad, and they've said you can call anytime, day or night, anytime in the middle of the night that you get upset or scared, you can call. Well, 2 years later, she died in a car wreck. And she was my person who I had connected with and who I had actually shared, the only person that I had shared. And then she was gone. So my fear just kept growing. Well, as it turns out, it was my father's death that gave me healing. And that's just the way and the nature sometimes of the beauty of life and what I would call the beauty of God. When my father began to decline to the point that he really couldn't go on in life, it was from an experience of he developed gangrene, and a juvenile diabetic, that's often what happens, right? He was on dialysis, which was a godsend, and I was taking him to a doctor's appointment, and the doctor was talking about this horrendous surgery they wanted to do and all of this, and on the way home I said, Dad, I think we need to talk. And I think that I need to say, you need to think about if this is the time for your life to end. And I, who was terrified of death and had spent my life denying, my father's death and all of this and had created this whole big fear, I was the one who realized, wow, there are things worse than death. There are things worse than death. And I see some nods. Your stories, I hope that my story is connecting with your stories. And one of the things that can be worse than death is denying death to the point that your life loses its quality. And so as we were driving, the words that came out of my mouth was, Daddy, right now I'm having to mourn you one body part at a time, and I don't want to do that anymore. I want to mourn the wholeness of your soul. That's healing. And it happened because I got to walk with my father. And all the way through. It wasn't a sudden death. And these are different things when you have long-term death and sudden death. So I'm talking long-term. So in this process, what happened was we had beautiful healing. My father had the best quality of his life in the last 3 weeks of his life when he decided to go off of dialysis. And that's why I said it was a blessing that he was on dialysis, because it meant he could go off dialysis. And renal failure, kidney failure, is a beautiful way to die because you just get sleepier and sleepier. And it really is quite wonderful. And so, when managed properly, and we had the gift of hospice in our family. And it was in that point that I suddenly, and what happened was Daddy died in our living room, right? In our home. And we all cared for him. And it was beautiful. We laughed. We told stories. We sat with him while he was asleep. He began to get very afraid of the darkness. And that happens sometimes when people die. And often it happens when, it's a psychological thing. It's like if you say, I'm going to control my anxiety in a certain situation. No, the anxiety often controls us, right? So when we don't get to escape the aspects of being born or dying. And so some people, when they die, become very anxious. And so we helped him with that. And we knew when that was going to start. It started like clockwork every day at 5 o'clock. And we would start helping with that. To be able to aid him in dying was a great gift for me. And then I discovered something absolutely astonishing. That I was actually really good at it. And I didn't know how that was going to play out, because when I was 23, let me tell you, the last thing I was thinking about was becoming an Episcopal priest. That was just not in the cards. And so that was almost a decade and a half later before that came out. But all of these life experiences played in to what I do now. And so what I have found is that when I attend deaths, my whole goal is for the people that I love to have the best death they can possibly have, and for their family members to be blessed by what I would call a holy death. Now, as I was doing this, so that I'm going to sort of walk you through this concept. When David began telling me about this lecture and asking if I'd be a part of it, I began to think about the differences between birth and death. And I realized that, I spend a lot of time trying to talk to people about making plans in advance. And I think it's very important. One of the ways that we have a good death and that we die well, and Henry Nouwen says one of the greatest gifts we give, the last great gifts we give is to die well. And I've had people look at me and like, how do you die well? I'm trying to stave off death. Aren't we trying to keep ourselves together as much as possible? There is a way to die well. And there's a way, and one of the ways you're doing it right now is you're coming and talking and thinking about it, and to see it within the context of life, as David has presented this. So one of the things that I realized is that when my daughter was born, and this is when I need to take a quick break. Over here. And boy, if you read this word for word, you're going to know more about me than you really want to know. Because I really put it all in here. So when my daughter was born, I did a birthing plan. All right? And so, first of all, we sort of said to the hospital that we were going to, this is the care that we've received, and this is what we hope to receive. And then we divided it in sections. So Jeff is my daughter's father. And so labor, we said, these are the things that we want to happen. And there's certain things that I didn't want to have happen, and that were common at that point, where they strap on a monitor, and it's like cinching you down, and you're contracting, and they have this thing around you it's like craziness. And I didn't want that anywhere near me. All right, so we did. So this took us a long time. That Jeff and I talked about it. We took it to our doctor. We talked about it with the doctor, and we went all the way. This thing goes all the way through. I mean, we didn't leave much to chance here, okay?
I started to type that personality.
In a way, yes, but in another way, the other thing that I got from growing up with a father who was ill is that I spent a lot of time in hospitals, and I spent a lot of time with uncaring medical professionals. And by golly, I was having this child, and I was paying them. And I wanted to be clear about that I had given some thought, and I also wanted to be treated as a person that had common sense and that had done their work to prepare to have this child. And so, and yes, I am type A. There's without a doubt. All right, so we go through all of this. And then at the bottom, you'll see the attending physician's signature. By signing off, you simply acknowledge your understanding and agreement with the above provisions. These provisions are based upon a normal, healthy delivery and can be disregarded should the delivery prove complicated. So you can actually take over if your medical degree is necessary, right? So I started thinking about all this, and I was thinking, I did this for Holland. Well, I want the same care. I want to think about the care that I want to receive in the dying process. And I have never seen anyone ever come to the dying process with a plan of how they want to be treated. Because most of the time, we're still trying to decide what treatments we're going to do, and and then calling hospice in is like tolling the death knell, isn't it? I mean, people are afraid to call hospice. So we're not saying we're not thinking and giving real thought to how to make our death beautiful. It's a concept that our society doesn't hold to very much. What's interesting about this birthing plan is that almost to a T, and I got a real kick out of it as I was reading it, every single thing that I said I didn't want to happen had to happen. Yes. I had this thing strapped on, I couldn't move. Yeah. 9 hours and 45 minutes, but it was a very excruciating 9 hours and 45 minutes. But anyway, that's because, that's the way it was. But nevertheless, the part about the baby and what's going to happen to her, the nurses came to me at the end and said, can we make a copy of this? They said, we've never seen anything like this, and it made our job so much easier because we knew what you wanted. So I think the same is true in the dying process. So what I did, as my homework for you all, is I said, wait a minute, I'm going to make a dying plan. So this is just a start, okay? Because I've just started on this, and I'll hopefully have years and years to perfect this. But this is my end-of-life plan, all right? And so this is actually my end-of-life plan. This isn't a hypothetical, okay? So the first thing I said is, this isn't replacing anything, I have my legal, this isn't a legal document. This is how I want to be cared for. And at any time, should these wishes become burdensome to my family, I want it to be known that my family doesn't need to adhere to these. This is also to be considered once the active dying process is started. So are you all familiar with what active dying is versus like chronic illness? It might be helpful if you're chronically ill, then that means you have a condition that isn't going to lead to your imminent death. Okay? If you're terminally ill, that means you have a condition that, if untreated, will lead to your death, and could be that there is no treatment for your condition, and that will lead to your death. Okay, so that's terminal illness. But terminal illness and active dying are two different things, because the active stages of dying are when your body is actively shutting down, and that's different than simply having a terminal. Okay, I'm not going to be that. Yes, having a terminal illness is not a good day, but it is different when you're actively dying. And when you're actively dying, that doesn't necessarily mean you're bedridden and you can't go anywhere. So one of the things to realize is that when you're actively dying, it's like people in labor. Some of them get up and go to the grocery store and walk around, and they're and others are in the bed moaning. You just don't know. So this plan is for once the active dying stage starts. And that can last, for my father, active dying was 3 weeks. For other people, it's 24 hours. The statistic is people who call in hospice live with hospice for less than 24 hours because we're so afraid to call in the aid in dying because it means we've given up. And so that's something that I want to sort of challenge our thinking on, that acknowledging your death is not a process of giving up. It's a process of embracing what is next. All right? So, controlling? Yes, I'll be the first one. It drives me crazy when I go into somebody's room and here you are laying and they're going, well, yes, he's not feeling good, or they talk to you like you're an infant. And, so when I encountered nurses, we had a 16-year-old die in our congregation in January. And the nurses never, in the pediatric unit, never referred to him as sweetie or honey or anything like that. They came in and said, hey, Michael, how's it going today? All right, let's move you up. And I'm like, I'm going to see 80-year-old people who are being called, okay, sweetie, now what I need you to... Oh, so I thanked him one day. And I said, I appreciate your guarding this 16-year-old young man's dignity by the way you speak to him. And they just said, well, why? He's not a baby. And I thought, could you talk to the people on the other wards? Because, it would really help. So it comes from my experience, what I've written down. So I don't need you to read through all of this because I've actually made a copy for each one of you of these slides. So I'll hand that to you afterwards. One of the things that you have to pre-think, and I encourage people to pre-think, is when it is clear that you are dying, it still happens that you can be the last one to know that. Even with HIPAA and all of that it can still be that the doctor meets with your family out in the hallway. Well, this doesn't look good. Hello! If it doesn't look good to them, it really doesn't look good to you. Oh, I wandered, didn't I? I promised him I wouldn't wander. And so, talking now, when you're healthy, talking now, just matter of fact with your family and saying, it's not going to offend me to find out that I'm dying, but it might offend me if I think you know something that I don't know and that I'm not a part of it. And that's up to you. You may like not knowing. And that would be the conversation to have also, wouldn't it? If you find out that I'm dying, you just don't let me know and I'll figure it out on my own. That is fine. You get to decide that. And I can see value in that, especially if you're a worry, whatever. Who knows? If you just don't want to be bothered with it, make that decision. But it's not a decision until you've articulated it, right? Because the people who are caring for you need the blessing of knowing what they're doing. So, I also am a person of sense of humor, So I've had to put a line in there that said, slap me upside the head, more, not really. But if I start getting grouchy, remind me that's not how I really want to do this process. So, and because I've watched grouchy people. I've watched people, it's really funny. I've watched people who, they're in such pain and then they can say, "Now you stop that over there, you're just bothering me to know." Really? Or did you just want to grouch? And so then we're all trying not to laugh. But for me, the dying process is filled with laughter. And the reason why is because life for me is filled with laughter. And so when I'm with families, I will have them look at me and apologize when they start laughing. "Oh, I'm sorry, we shouldn't be laughing, should we?" "Are you kidding?" "Yes, you should be laughing." The last person whose death I attended, I fussed at him. I said, "I told you I was not going to let you out of this world until you gave me your baked bean recipe." Now, he was not verbal anymore. And I said, "So I'm saying right now, you can't go until I get the bacon, and it better be in that kitchen written down somewhere because I'm going to..." And he had this smile, and it just came up. He could only move one part. And he was smug. He intentionally did not give me that recipe. And he told me right there on his deathbed. It was so funny. And so, and it was a beautiful, beautiful time. Wait a minute, let me see. And I'm going to talk about this in a minute. But one of the things also that for me that's very important is I anoint people at the time of their death. And that can either be before they die or after they die or while they're dying. And so for me to be anointed is really important. For me to be anointed surrounded my family would be a blessing to my soul, because that's the way I try to do anointings with people. So what I found is that, and I'm watching my time? Yeah. Oh, we're good. So what I found is that when I start doing the work that I do, okay, when I come in to be with people who are dying, that they're surprised. Because I'm not really a great presence sometimes, and especially when I show up like this, when I have the oil in my hand, this means that the person they love is pretty close to dying. And our society has so removed death from its everyday life. We used to lay people out in the parlor, didn't we? And people came, and we washed them. With our own hands, we washed them. We clothed them in their best clothes. Or, something that we thought would be kind of funny. Something they really didn't like. It was a personal moment. Maybe somebody had just the best hat ever. And, the family could choose. And so that moment of personalizing, cleaning and bathing and putting on nice clothes, and then receiving all friends and family into the house. The kids grew up that way. Your grandparents grew up this way, right? And some of you may still do this. This is still done in certain parts. Some of my parishioners, actually, this is still a tradition in their family. And what we do now is the opposite. And so the person is taken away. You have to go to a funeral home to meet and to sign all these papers. And I'm going to talk about that in a minute. And it gets to be very complicated. And we've removed, so what you have is this moment of death, which is very painful, and you don't have the resolve. So the resolve of standing around, of caring, of, the different ways in which in the past we've had. What I have found is that people I see my own story, and that's why I started with my story of fear. Because I now see the fear that I had growing up reflected in the faces of the people with whom I walk. And so what happens when I come in and then once I do the anointing process, which I do a very particular anointing process, and I'll tell you about in a second, they're astonished because they're no longer afraid. Doesn't mean they're happy, but it means they're fully present and their fear isn't blocking them from the experience of death. And that right there is what I hope we can all take away, that we're no longer allowing our fear to be in the way. Now, I can tell by shoulder shrug, you might already be there. Some people just don't have any fear of death, and that is fabulous. But a lot of people do. What happens then is that the next thing that we do is we have a time when we come together and to celebrate the person's life in one way or another, just depending on the traditions. And I have found that that's also something that a number of people don't like to do, because they've either had bad experiences at funerals or, whatever causes that. And when you allow people, when an experience happens where it's actually beautiful, I get people doing this. Well, I didn't know it could be like this. After the funeral of Michael Sandridge, the 16-year-old, the comments that I got back were, I came not knowing how I would make it through. I never imagined it could be a joyful occasion. One of the things we've lost in our society as faith traditions become less a part of our culture, as family traditions are removed because funeral homes take a part of that, what has happened is the things that brought comfort to us don't exist anymore. And we're left with the sorrowful and painful parts without the healing parts. So that's one of the things that I think our society is going to have to address. We have to make it so that these traditions, these beautiful ways of finding healing within the process of losing someone we love, can be regained. All right. Let me make sure I showed you everything that was kind of... And that was the other thing that, what feels good to you? Sorry, I jumped around a little bit here, but I forgot about this slide. What feels good to you? Well, I didn't want anybody to have to guess what feels good to me. So, I want to continue. When I can't read the daily office, I want somebody to read it to me, because those words, hopefully by the time I die, I'll have read these words for, how many years, day and night. And so that cadence, doesn't matter if I understand the words, doesn't matter, the cadence will bring a peace to my soul. My daughter's singing to me. Gently rubbing my feet. But the person attending me might not know that. And they might try to rub my hands, which don't like to be rubbed. So rub my feet. And I have wild hair. And it bothers me when it gets really, really big. And so keeping it tidy is important to me. These are the things. You have your things, right? The scent of lavender is the best thing, but the bottom one is really, really important to me. Because I grew up in a household with medical supplies all over it. I don't want to see them. I want it to be like my birthing room. Have you seen the modern birthing rooms? Right? It looks like you're just in a bedroom. And the minute that mama starts to push, wham, wham, shoom, 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 and everything opens up and you're suddenly in a labor and delivery room. But until then, it just looked like you were in a bedroom. And so there are ways to do that. And so I didn't even think about it until I was writing this up. And I was like, you know what? I want those little plastic bins or whatever underneath the bed. I don't want to see it. It can be there where people can get to it. I don't want to see it. And then I'm actually going to I have a doctor's appointment this week, and I'm going to take this to my doctor, and I'm going to get him to sign off on it and put it in the file. This is, and I'll say every year I come, I might be making an addition to this, but this is where I am right now. And he knows me really well, so he'll say, okay. Yeah. Control much? Yeah. He'll have the same thing. I have files on about half of my parishioners for wishes and things like, who's your executor? Because I get asked these questions. I'm like they told me, So, all right. So that's sort of the process that I hope that you can claim, that you feel empowered to claim or I invite you to claim your dying process and to let your family, and nothing else on the way home, talk with whoever you rode here about what you want. I mean, do you want to be cremated? Do you want to be buried? Do you not know? Do you not care? And then let me just tell you, if you're the surviving person and the person didn't communicate, I'm going to be bold here, then it doesn't matter. Because they would have told you if it was really important, and you need to make decisions that are best for you. You cannot make decisions for someone else and guess into what they would have wanted. You will drive yourself crazy. So that's another thing I give permission for people to do. All right, changes. I want to tell you a little bit about some changes that have happened and that clergy are going to have to start working with the state legislature on. 6 months ago, a change was made in state law where now when you die, all right, and you arrive at the funeral home, even if you came from a hospital, even if you came from hospice, all right, you have to be identified in the facility that is going to prepare your body for death. You might think, okay, now imagine, you stood at the bedside and you think you've said your final goodbye, and now you have to see them again in an impersonal setting that is not the home, or that is, say it was something traumatic, all right, and you now have to see your loved one again, and you thought you had said your final goodbye. This is a major, major change. You do not have to be the one to do this, all right? They will tell you, one of you needs to come identify the body, in which you can say, no, someone needs to identify the body. And so if you don't want to, you don't have to. Someone else can. The minister, your minister can, anybody who knows that person and can say. And that's really important for you to know, all right? So what happened in the case of Michael Sandridge is his parents said goodbye to him. They, as a family, they got to the funeral home simply to fill out the paperwork. And they were told, okay, one of you needs to go identify him. And they had made their decision that they didn't want to see him again, that they had seen him the way they wanted to. And now they were forced to do that. And it was not done compassionately at all. And it is a trauma that parents who lost their 16-year-old son, it was one of the worst things that happened because they were already in a horrible place. And they had managed to get through that, and they were just ripped open right there unexpectedly. All right? So, some of us, and many voices need to say, whoa. And so when I was talking to the funeral home in town about it, and I said, this is crazy. What's going on? And I said, please always call me. I will always identify for my people. And he said, Phyllis, this is just the half of it. What the new legislation that's being put up is there's a 19-page document that we're going to have to go through with every family. And you're going to have to sit there to go through 19 pages of documents. So, the dying process isn't getting any easier. And our society is making it so that we create fear and dread of death instead of bringing it back to the place that I think David is trying to get us to. So David is way forward thinking on what needs to happen in our society versus where we are right now. So sorry, I'm telling you that because we all have the ability to call and to write letters and to make changes. So please talk to your local funeral home. See how it's affecting them. And the families, and also encourage them to be compassionate when they ask for the body to be identified. And I would bet it's kind of like HIPAA. A lot of them just aren't doing it, because they know they don't want to do it. So what we have are rituals, and so I want to end with not a really great slide. Sorry, I should put something pretty at the end. What I want to do is just to quickly tell you. What I do at the time that somebody's dying and how I anoint. And this is something that a friend of mine and I in seminary talked about. And then I just sort of have made it my own over time. So as I go, as I tell you about it, I'm just going to wash your hand. Okay? Or yeah, you can just stick your thumb in there. Just stick your thumb in there. And you can smell it. Because this is the smell I'm surrounded with. And it stays on my skin it'll stay for a couple days. So as I go, it's an anointing oil, and I use different kinds. This is the one I'm using right now. So it's a pleasant smell, and so I pray for the person because I smell it on my hand when I bring my hands up close to my face. So what I do is I get all the family around the person who's dying, and we all touch the person. And we all lay hands on the person in some way, all right? And I start with the head. And as I anoint the head, I pray for this center, the center of knowledge and thought of what made this person them. And I invite stories. So when I get to a certain place and I say something in prayer, if somebody has something they want to add to it or a story, then they just break in and say the story. It's very slow. There's no real method. And I just work my way around the body. And so when I get to the hands, I pray for all the work they did, for the peanut butter sandwiches they made, or if they were a knitter, and all the teachings that they've done, whatever they've done with their hands. And so people will say, memories of the hands, the feet. And for me, the next, part of the feet is that the next steps that they take will be fully in the presence of God. But all the things that they've done in life. And you hear stories about vacations, you hear stories, stories just start coming and coming. And then we mark the chest for the place that is the essence of that person's soul. And the way, and we believe the soul is the place, this is where we know the Holy Spirit. This is the place of God for our tradition. And so people talk about the essence of the person beyond life, but what that person meant to them. And then I anoint the lips, sometimes the eyelids. It just depends on where we're called, and we journey around the person's body. I've had people die in the middle, and I finish the anointing even though I know they've taken their last breath, but the family doesn't know. I've had people wake up in the middle of their anointing, and they're from almost a coma. No, that's a little shocking. Don't mind us, you're dying. And this is kind of creepy. But you just laugh, and then we say, this is what we've been doing. Is there something you would like for me to anoint? every time the person, I've only had it happen twice where the person's woken up at both times, they've had something to say. And one was their ears, and I had never anointed ears before. And I said, tell me why you want your ears. And he said, I could hear you even though I couldn't get to you. All right, so by the time we finish this, the people who were in a place of fear, do you feel yourself right now in just a different place? It's a place of beauty. And it's one of the most sacred privileges we have. My hope for you is that you live well and you die well. It is a gift. Thank you.
Well, Phyllis and I thought that there would be ample time for discussion, and there is, and questions, thoughts, comments, and so you're free to ask or share whatever you'd like.
Do we want to stand up there, or do we want to sit down, or how do you
I
want
think
this
you should
discussion to
probably come
go?
up here. Yeah. Yes.
Did the government give any reason why there's 19 pages of documents to sign?
I haven't had a discussion with the government. I just had a discussion with Eddie Trump at Horn Funeral Home, and Eddie's livid.
Which agency of the government is responsible for that?
His words were it came through the legislature. So, I'm not sure who's pushing this, but my thought, don't you think somebody somewhere cremated the wrong, yeah.
Somebody had to bring it up.
But it's state, not federal.
It's state. It is state. I'm serious. I have just experienced this recently, and I'm in the process of trying to sort all of that out. We have an advocacy, we'll work with advocacy groups and lobbyists to try to figure out where is this coming from and why. But yeah, it's a worrisome thing.
Often what happens is some error is made, or something, and then the attempt to correct it is not very well thought out.
600 laws of Moses.
Question
You call. He'll moderate all this.
for Phyllis. The Virginia Cremation Society, when I die, my wife calls an 800 number. They come from South Boston, they pick up the body, they take it cremated, they provide the death certificate and everything else. I wonder how this 19 pages would affect something like that.
Yeah, you may be getting an addendum in the mail. I don't know. That's a really, and they would be an excellent place to ask, because that that's a really good source of information, and that's a wonderful thing because all those arrangements have been made. Yeah.
Bill?
In the notice in the Martinsville Bulletin a couple of weeks ago about your talk today, you referenced Rabbi Heschel, and I'm not sure how to pronounce his name.
Heschel, yes, that's correct.
And I just read a little bit about him online. And one of the things that he wrote about in the privilege of dying is that he said that not even a soul can be created out of nothing. He said once we die, our physical body dies and our soul goes to wherever it goes to. But he said not even a soul can be created out of nothing. And therefore, if we have an afterlife, we must have had a prior to life. Am I reading that correctly?
Well, you have to ask Rabbi Heschel about that. I will tell you what I think about that.
People's thoughts might be on
Yeah,
that.
or
You go.
Reincarnation.
That's different though.
One of the really great and beautiful mysteries is how things come to be and how they pass away. How the things that your mother ate took that tiny little bit of embryo and made the beginnings of you. It's most amazing. And one of the things that's very important about that is new in the last 50 years of the way we think about how atoms and molecules behave is what's called the information that matter carries. So matter, first of all, has mass, charge, bulk, it's that. But it also possesses something called information, which I think actually you could think of like soul. You can't hold the information. The information is embedded in the matter. But when the matter changes, that's not the same information anymore. And you can't separate, in fact, you really can't separate the two. And I think I've mentioned this before, that the philosopher Aristotle had a very lovely way of thinking about this. He said, everything is made up of what he called this prime matter. That's the stuff that's sort of heavy, bulky, but it's formless. It doesn't, but it's got substance, but it doesn't have shape, form, delicacy. And the other part of it he called the informational part. And he didn't use that word. He called it the form. And you don't find matter by itself, and you don't find form by itself. They're locked together. And that's really true of when you look at something as complicated as you. That all those atoms and molecules that make you up are radiant in a kind of the information that they hold. And that's not oxygen, it's not nitrogen, it's not carbon. It's the unique way they are now together. And the way we talk about that in modern quantum information theory, for example, is that it's really the information, or it's the quantum wave function. So there, take that.
That's kind of the sum of the whole is greater than its parts.
It's true, yes. Yes.
I just want to comment, I think that was a wonderful way of processing that you went through. I've just, in a short period of time, lost a sister and a son and a husband. And that was a beautiful story. My son was a pastor also, and he had a very detailed printout of his death because he knew he was going to die because he had MS and it affected his organs. So I don't know if that has something to do with you ministers because you experience death more than most people because of your line of work. And I thought that was a beautiful thing that your church or you have perfected through your ministry. It was wonderful.
Thanks for sharing your loss. It helps us all. It personalizes what we're talking about. Death affects all of us. And I wish I could say that ministers prepare. I mean, I just did the service last summer for the rector emeritus of St. Thomas, and he had been on dialysis. Father Tatum, he'd been on dialysis for, 3 years, something like that. Sorry. Thank you. Yes, he'd been on, I still was probably making it go. He'd been on dialysis for a long, anyway, no plans. And when I talked to him right before his death, I said, so, can I get a copy of your plans? He said, I'm just starting those. It's like lawyers that don't have wills, So I say, really?
Yeah.
Have your will, have.
Well, it's a very unselfish thing to plan. I was fortunate in hearing about, knowing about hospice and hearing about doing all the final instructions many, many years ago, and counsel my father to help him get his things together. This was prior to 95, but even my mother in 85 passed away. And, I knew what her wishes were, and she didn't put it in writing.
But you knew.
But, we knew. One of the things our church has done, so I'm at Starling Avenue Baptist Church in Martinsville, and we have a folded sheet with questions that everybody in the church is encouraged to fill out about what hymns do you want in your, do you want a funeral, do you want a service of celebration, what hymns do you want, this, that, and the other, and all of that's there for you to fill out and give and hand in for David Atkins to have the pastor or whoever the pastor will be at that time. And I think that's such a wonderful thing to do, and it takes such a burden off your family. The other thing we've done, besides making sure we had the living will and power of attorney, the health surrogates, there's still people out there that don't know about that. The power of attorney only covers you when, and you all probably know all this here already, but only covers when a person is terminal, but you've got to have the health surrogate to have someone be able to make decisions on your behalf when you're not considered terminal but incapacitated. But one of the things we've done is I went through recently and made a list of everything of any value whatsoever in the house and wrote down the things that I knew certain children had already indicated they would be interested in one day. And I wrote those down and then wrote instructions about how we would want them to take turns, asking for the different things, take the remainder, auction it off. I want 5% to go to Hope Tree in Salem, and 5% to go to the church, and so tithing, making sure there's that last tithe. But it was funny when I sent the list to our daughter. She said, "Is there something you want to tell me?"
We assume.
And I said, "No, we're fine to our knowledge right now." But all of those things, Richard's mother, when she broke up housekeeping and went to live at King's Grant, called in the kids. They said what they wanted. It was all taken care of in a very common sense, compassionate way, so that in all these circumstances, the family's left with minimal added stress on top of their own grief. And I think that's the last gift we can give to them.
Can I so you're making me remember one thing, and that is that we can take care of all that, and I'm not saying this is the case with you, but I'm thinking of a woman in particular who had all of that taken care of, and she was the one that really got me started on doing this work on a holy death, because she was a pillar of the church and she was terrified and had a miserable death, and she did all of these things, but she didn't touch the thing that was the most important, And so some of us do it and we're thinking it all the way through. We've done the spiritual work, but there was something in her that terrified her to die. And so her dealing with all the aspects of those very important things, she never dealt with the question that something was in her. And by the time I realized how terrified she was without language. And so I just had to sit there and watch her be terrified through the whole process. And it wasn't something that was happening to her then. It was clear. She was fighting something from the past. And so we have to clean out all our cupboards.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so that's just...
No, I just want to throw in, you mentioned that, which I think is very important, that if something isn't specified, the person didn't care, and those who are left can do what they want.
That might have been a little harshly stated. They might have cared.
I feel very, very strongly about that, because there are some of us who are not control freaks, who in fact don't want to bother. Who say, anything you like, you're the ones who are left.
That's right. Exactly.
I'm gone. I'm out of here. The only problem with that, I'm fully aware, is that children get fighting with each other over it. And
even if you do that, they still fight.
But you can't control what other people do. You can only control your actions.
I feel that anyone who leaves the do as you like instructions should add the no fighting, no biting.
No fighting, no biting.
Phyllis, I think there's an important topic that maybe we don't have really enough time for, but maybe you could just briefly say something about. We live in an era now in which we have such advanced medical technologies that it's possible to keep going on and on when one is approaching death. And especially with some of the diseases like cancer, some of these interventions are actually quite traumatic. You go through a very difficult and painful period, and you hope that it's going to result in a more fruitful time that you can go on with. And sometimes that happens and sometimes it doesn't. Since I'm not directly involved, you have had a lot of experience. What wisdom would you bring, or what can you tell us, and what wisdom do you have about the great availability of technologies to be brought to bear on situations that are close to being terminal, but maybe the terminus can be moved out a tiny bit farther?
Not sure I put it in here. Yes, the bottom one. My presence at any doctor's office is for the purpose of information and not for treatment until such time as I decide that I wish to pursue treatment. That's a direct result of my experience. What I have learned is that when you walk into an oncologist's office, what you are saying by paying your copay is cure me. And if you can't cure me, throw everything you can at me until my body gives up. Know that. That's their job. That's not a bad thing. But when you walk in their office, that's what they do. So you don't walk in their office and want them not to treat you unless you make it very clear, I am just here to get information. Because in my mother's case, I was there saying, okay, and my mom was there saying, we do not want anything. She had pancreatic cancer, okay? That's not treatable. Not in the stage that she was in. She, however, was married, fairly newly married, and my stepfather was not in the same place that we were in. And so she went through a lot of treatments for him. So to answer your question, and that was the right thing. And she suffered unbelievable pain so that he could come to grips with what she already knew. And the only reason she did it was to give him time to come to grips. So the more we have these conversations with those we love, we can avoid that, I think. But I think it's important to know that when you go into an oncologist office or any specialist office, you're saying, treat me. The days of the GP, see, that's another place that we've lost it, haven't we? It used to be that the GP would look at you and say, get your affairs in order. You try to find a doctor who will look at you and say, get your affairs in order. And if you do, you are in the right place. You really and truly are in the right place because they're willing to talk to you about dying. Doctors are geared nowadays to that's a failure. If the person dies, that's a failure. And they don't. And so you have the older ones who are who have a feet in kind of both worlds. But the younger ones, we can solve anything. So I think it's a real issue, David.
I might, since I don't really have any good data and I'm not really knowledgeable about it, but I do have an impression just from living in the world and experiencing people's individual dealings with death, even the recent one we had with 16-year-old Michael Sandridge. My feeling is, and I don't know whether this is false or not, is that there is way too much tendency to go for the next thing that might give you an increase of 10% chance to live longer. That we are too much oriented towards saying, yes, if it's got any chance of working, let's do it.
And what we don't is stop and count the cost. Absolutely. And I have now, my pendulum has swung so far this way that I tell my daughter the hardest thing is going to be to get me treated for a cancer that's treatable. Because, I don't want to have anything to do with it. I'm just going to, sit there, it's going to start as a little speck, and I don't know what's going to happen because I'm like, I'm not doing anything. I don't do anything. So I recognize, but it's in reaction. So right now, I'm waiting for the pendulum to come back to center. I'm way over here because one of the things that David and I have talked about is the cost. And the cost there's cost to the family, there's financial cost, there's cost to society. We have people who don't have food in our communities, and we have someone else who's getting a $30,000 2-hour medical treatment. We have to talk about that. And we don't want to because the sanctity of life is so great, but whose life? So this is that could be a subject all of itself. I mean, it really, really could be. Because, as we've said, if it was my child, what would I do, But the question should always be quality of life. And you will have a hard time getting an oncologist to talk to you about quality of life. Never, ever, ever go to a doctor's appointment of this nature by yourself. Even the most simplistic one. You always need someone in the room with you who's really good at processing data. So that might not be your spouse. That might not be your child. It needs to be someone who excels at processing information. Because you're not going to remember what they say.
My question, and I would have a lot of them, but my question revolve around cultural variations in this scheme of things, euthanasia and suicide, are issues that our Christian background kind of pushes aside. But I think there are real significant alternatives. And I'd like to hear you talk about cultural variations in the scheme of death that you're aware of that are different than our mechanized, technologized approach.
Well, I'm not an anthropologist, so I'm not going to be able to help very much on that. I'm not sure exactly what you're asking.
Well,
maybe you could be more specific about what you're getting at.
Some cultures accept suicide.
I see.
Euthanasia, and
right.
Our culture is bent on the Christian background, and I see a lot of holes in that myself personally.
Has it ever confused you as to why, when someone doesn't take their dog to the vet, that people will be talking? You notice that? That dog, they're holding on to it way too long. They're just making that dog suffer. All right? And yet, for people, we're the exact opposite, right? We're saying, that you should pursue every treatment, that you should keep going, that no suffering is too much suffering, and then we don't, as my daughter says, yes, exactly. So that's what I'm speaking to, is that, your thing culturally, I think it's really interesting. We value the suffering of our dogs more than we do. Or that's the only, we value the suffering of our dogs in a different way than we do of humans. And whether it's a greater or lesser degree, I don't know. But what I do know is that it's a stark contrast. Because when I hear people talk, when I hear my parishioners talk about laying down an animal, it's a conversation that I can't have about whether we should increase the morphine on someone who's in agony. Because it might suppress respiration. It just might. But they're in agony and they're unconscious, and so I get confused.
Tuberculosis used to be called the old man's friend.
And pneumonia is called
the
old person's friend.
Or pneumonia.
Yeah.
And it's possible that morphine is the old dying,
so
dying person's friend.
And I watch people in dementia, who don't know anything, who can't feed themselves, and they get treated for pneumonia. That's stunning to me. It's stunning.
This is this turbulent time. This is the wild time, and this is a time when I think a lot of these attitudes are going to have to be changed. The fact that most of the resources of a society, an aging society like we have in America, or even worse in Japan, is devoted to people who are close to the end of their lives, while young people just starting out are deprived, is just morally wrong, in my judgment. And I'm on this upper category. It's wrong to do that. It's wrong for me to take resources away from a young person.
And some cultures have made that decision and make it entirely acceptable for the elderly or useless.
Actually, it just came to me the cultural answer to your question. The Inuit. I think is this in the top of the world? In the top of the world, a grandmother. Now, first of all, this is a very tough situation to live in, and just about everybody who is alive has to work to feed, has to fish, or has to help make clothing. Its existence really, there's no slack. And so when a grandmother knows she's getting to be a burden, she will go out and walk out into the ice and loosen her clothing so that she will freeze to death. Now I don't know how accurate that story is, but was it in that book, The Top of the World?
It was in that book. It was a picture which was really quite nice.
But
of
the
her
book was quasi-fictional.
walking fast so that she would
Filled up with
perspire,
sweat.
which she had been taught from childhood never to do, because if you perspire, then it will freeze, and then you will freeze with hypothermia. And that book was based on strong.
It was based on anthropology, but it was
and on study and
yeah.
on living within it.
Right.
And there's a time to die. They go and die. And I imagine, actually, talking about all of these end of life issues today, that most people, like dementia, that has pneumonia, would have died earlier. That they would not be alive into this, state right now. I'm just talking with a daughter of an old friend who was a man of great substance and international reputation. And he's alive, but he's walking, getting out of his bed in the middle of the night and taking off his clothes and walking naked down the corridor. And it's very painful to think of for his family, a person of enormous dignity and substance, and you feel, it shouldn't be this way. And I think it's because we have the ability to keep ourselves going when it was time for us to move on.
Our political debates are enormously crude. It's so black and white, there is no nuance, there is no refinement, there is no careful thinking. It's euthanasia. It's, are you going to kill grandma? And I think we need to, slowly wise up, and people need to say, oh, you don't want to listen to that kind of talk.
I don't know about slowly wising up as much as things we can prolong this existence. We're living so much longer. Things are in such a state of flux, and we're hanging on to mythologies that are 2,000 years old, and we're not adjusting what it is. If we're born, we're not able to adjust the culture at the pace of things to embrace birth and dying. So we're allowing things to go into the modes of letting the state decide for us. We're letting churches that hang on to mythologies that are 2,000 years old to make decisions for us and put us within a structure that is very resistant to change. And we bring about this thing with politics and everything else to where it becomes so structured in a way that we can't embrace, or we're not willing to have conversations, whether it be at church or on the state level or anything else that will bring into it the idea of, do we have a say-so in how we die, in the euthanasia mindset and that kind of thing?
I think you are not accurate. I mean, I think basically what you're saying is it's got a lot of truth to it. But if you look back on the 20th century and see where we've come from in the last 100 years, it is stunning. It's absolutely stunning. Black people were essentially completely deprived for most of the 20th century until the mid-20th century. And the Civil Rights Revolution took place. Women couldn't vote in the first part of the 20th century. And now women are excelling in college. Women are in places of authority. And I think that's one of the most important changes that's taking place, and I hope it takes place internationally, because it's desperately needed in so many parts of the world that are still living under a patriarchal society. So there has been change, and there are times, my natural instinct is a very progressive instinct, but there are times when I think, maybe it's important that there's some drag anchors on the boat that don't let it change so fast that it gets into trouble. Something to think about, and that's when I say, okay, the conservatives have something here that's worthwhile. It's worth thinking about. It's worth having a kind of drag, a kind of clinging to the past. But nature doesn't work that way. Nature is not going to hang on to the past. The natural world is always in motion. It's moving forward, and you either are going to move with it or you will be left behind. And our politics, our political system doesn't understand that. I don't even know if anybody on the Supreme Court understands anything about biology.
Yeah, just 30 years ago, how many women would have been on corporate boards?
Yes, and the other one that has moved really fast is intimate relationships. Intimate relationships can now be gender independent.
Could he repeat that, please? We couldn't hear it.
Women were not present on corporate boards nearly 30 years ago. And even more striking is what's happened because of the separation of sex from birth. And a lot of people thought, this is terrible, this is a very bad thing. But sex for human beings is a very important part of the physicality that binds people together in emotional relationships. And that doesn't have to do with making babies. It came into being because you need people like that in that kind of tightly bound relationship who have a child and have to raise it together. But it can exist separately from it, and that's what's happened in the 20th century. It has become disconnected. And I'm sure some will find both good and bad things about this. But one of the things that's happened about it is people who want to support one another, who want to be bound together in affection and it's physical, can now do that. And it's not, and that was unthinkable 20 years ago.
And it's not going to be surprising that I'm going to want to jump in on that 2,000 years of the church. For one, it's not been 2,000 years. I mean, I don't think. I think that so much from the 1500s on influences the way we are today. And I think what I see in the church is a huge retaking of a place where that we're actually going back much more to a way of compassion and love rather than the call to really hardline, rule-oriented, very much, if you're here, you're okay. If you're not, you're damned. I see a great shift happening, at least in where I am, and maybe that's just because that's where I am. But the thing that I guess I bristle at the most is for those the church is the people, and there have been authority figures who took over, who will speak loudly, but each of us has to have our voice, and we have to say, and you don't throw the baby out with the bathwater kind of thing, but we have to say, what I found is that the traditions, my faith traditions, are beautiful and amazing, and they offer a gift to people. What we don't need is someone telling us that we have to have that. But we all have, if we get rid of too much, if we go too far, then what happens is we lose. And I think our society is losing ways that can be quite beautiful because we're bristling against the authority figures. And there's a way to find our voice within the realm, so for me, it's within the realm of God. And that might look very different than your realm of God. That might look very different than your realm. But the idea for me is that each of us needs to have our voice, and we need to speak it authentically and truthfully. The church, I agree, should not speak. But we as people should speak within the context as we know the Creator or as we know humanity. We each have to claim our voice. So I don't know if that is sort of what you're saying, or that was my reaction to what you were saying, is because I find my place within that 2,000 years of tradition. And there's some of it which I don't like at all. And I think, how can you have done that in the Crusades? I mean, David talked about the Crusades. What? That had nothing to do with what Christ taught. That has to do with power and human nature. And I think that's been around for way more than 2,000 years. And I think people usurped the church in order to, it was their new playground. Does that make sense?
I was speaking specifically to how to get from the womb to the tomb.
Yeah.
And the mythology that would take us there when we were on the subject of euthanasia and the cost to society and the cost of an older person. We were talking about the Inuit lady that was doing that, and there's nothing that I really see in that womb to the tomb teachings that we have that tell us to absolutely go ahead, step off the edge of the cliff for the younger people.
But I guess that's what I'm saying, that we have to find our way.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And speak from our experience.
And our experience, that we are the authorities on that in some ways, aren't we?
From the awareness that we have and see.
And what we can't have is somebody saying, and then that was wrong and horrendous. In a sense, that, it's hard. It's hard. This is all hard stuff.
Specifically, it is how hard it is to speak to a group, whether it speak to a conservative or a liberal or to the government, and speak who you are and speak to the church when you get into subjects like euthanasia and what is best for, and to do that thing because it is politically and religiously incorrect to go that way. So I'm saying that that's what we run up against when we speak our heart. We run up against many years of, this is my teaching and this is where I stand.
I hear you now.
I would agree with this 2,000 years, and I would question...
Well, I misunderstood him, I think, what he was saying. I got it now.
I will reassert what my intention is. It is 2,000 plus years of myths, and what I hold the modern churches and religions of the world responsible for this day, regardless of what liberal conservative aspect that they have of their different sects, is that they are separative and they are exclusive, and they're separating humans from humans and telling humans that you're different, I'm better, I come from a different tradition that's right and wrong, the Christian is better than the Buddhist.
That's very that's very true. But
I see that as a vital thing in modern culture.
But there's a way in which that issue, which is perfectly valid, a lot of what you're saying is absolutely true. But how people die, how people deal with depression, great sadness, how people live in the world, how people share joy together, this doesn't have much to do with doctrine or ideologies or patriarchs. It has to do with the kind of thing Phyllis is describing of being in the room with a dying person. And those kinds of, I have to tell you, I have an enormous sympathy for a huge number of my colleagues in science who are atheists. I find myself, in fact, much more at home with them than I do with people in religious institutions. But there is a very big missing ingredient, and that is what has been in the ministry of churches, this personal, hands-on, dying, being born, sharing joy, suffering, and to treat that as a medical situation, to me, is just enormously impoverished. So there is within the tradition of church a stream of personal ministry that is really, in many ways, kind of disconnected from the Pope in Rome, disconnected from the Imam, disconnected. It's people living in simple ways and wanting to know how to live with great sorrow or great joy, how to live with the loss of one's loved one. And these things still need ministry. They still, and that's something you can do in a sacramental situation. That's sort of the last vestige of it. And it's the goodness that the churches still have to offer, even though, as I say, I agree with much of what you're saying. And as I said, my theological and philosophical and scientific instincts are very much with the atheists.
It still just burns me to no end to think that the government and the churches have usurped what was the provision of the family. And when I say family, I don't mean my brothers and sisters, I mean all of us. This is a human issue that all humans identify with. All humans are spiritual. All humans are going to live and die. And these artificial methods of dealing with it are just a contrived example of our Christian upbringing and all the interpretations of left, right, up and down, holy water, and everything else. In so many other cultures, they have a different slant. It's human nature to want to deal with this, but it's a situation of humanity that we all share, whether it's someone in Iraq dying or someone down the street getting hit by a car. We all look at that situation and we all feel the empathy of every human being at the death of a mouse. We all share that, and that is what has been usurped by religions, governments, and everybody else to institutionalize it and give it rules, regulations. You're going to go to hell, you're going to heaven. You did this, you did that. All that is
just wait, be patient. Things are changing. It's a very dynamic time.
But you know,
participation in institutional churches is at an all-time low.
Is the essence of my faith. That's what the church has taught me. So what you just said.
Your family should have taught you that.
But they did within the context of faith. So, but we did. What you just described is what I preach almost every Sunday. So I'm thinking.
Why do you wear your clothes and go to an Episcopal church and do it?
Because that's my piece of the puzzle.
I'm another belief in that.
But that's my piece of the puzzle. I don't have to be your piece. I just have to be my piece, and I have to be really good at it. You're in charge of your piece, and you darn well better be good, because our puzzle's going to be ugly. So get on it. You do your piece. I'll do my piece. Don't judge my piece.
Okay, we are now going to have individual discussions, and I want to thank you all for coming, and maybe we'll continue to have a new lecture series next year. We'll just stay tuned to the Reynolds Homestead. We'll see what comes about.
Thank you. And there are handouts if you want them.